Chapter 701. It hurt so much that Olivia couldn't speak. Janice wanted to take a seat to enjoy the show, but to her surprise, Jessica and Daryl were on it again. It seemed like they were seizing this chance to make up an excuse for Harold to drive Olivia and the others out. Kenneth Miller, if you like that word so much, why don't you carve it on your gravestone in the future? Janice said. Displeased, Kenneth looked at her and said, zip it. This is none of your business. Janice then stood in front of Olivia and barked fiercely at him, you shut the fuck up. Kenneth was stunned, and so was Jessica. The spectators were equally dumbfounded too. Harold was the only person feeling awkward as he coughed lightly. Watch your words, Janice. Your mother-in-law is the feistiest person. She might call you up tonight. In the past, even when Janice was angry, she never scolded Jessica with bad words before. Janice was raised with a good upbringing in a rich family after all. However, she had become feistier after over 20 years. She even dared to use bad words now. Kenneth Miller, just what are your eyes for? Are you blind? If you're blind, I bet you still have a brain to think. Olivia was just sitting and didn't offend anyone. Daryl was the one who came up to her to cause trouble. No one overheard their conversation, yet you believed his story. Olivia isn't a mad woman. Why would she splash water at someone on this kind of occasion? Janice put Kenneth in an awkward spot. Kenneth's brows furrowed tightly as he thought, this woman isn't a goddess. Her temper has become viler than before. What else could Daryl say? He was simply worried about her. Janice, I know you hate me. But even though we're back, no one's stealing your positions. Your son will forever be Mr. Miller. You guys don't have to see Daryl and Jessica as enemies, he exclaimed. Olivia hugged her hurting stomach. Pale-faced, she stood up and bit her lip. Her son. Is Ethan not your son? Kenneth had nothing to say against her question. He also felt that he had put it in the wrong way. Never once had he perceived Janice as his wife. Even Ethan was a loathing existence to Kenneth because Jessica disliked him, and it made Kenneth feel sorry for her. Harold couldn't watch any longer and slammed his wheelchair, intending to stand up. But the butler forced him to sit down and said, calm down, Mr. Harold. Harold took a deep breath before saying, everyone, silence. Although Daryl and Jessica didn't have good intentions, it was still Harold's birthday. Harold had already lost his wife. He was also old and couldn't think straight at times, his days were numbered. Half of Harold's lifetime was spent fighting with Kenneth, hence the wish to have called it a truce for today. Harold simply wanted to enjoy the happy occasion with his children and grandchildren. As long as there were no fights, he was happy with a simple celebration. But to his dismay, Daryl and Jessica were plotting something again, and it had ruined his birthday banquet. Daryl was aware that Harold wanted peace, but Daryl was reluctant to grant his wish. Daryl knelt immediately. Grandpa, it's all my fault. Don't blame Mom. I'll accept any punishment. She simply cares for me. That's why. The weaker he acted, the more forceful Olivia and Janice seemed in comparison. Olivia finally knew what kind of life Janice had lived in the past. Chapter 702. Jessica was crying so much that she could barely catch her breath. Kenneth, I thought that Grandpa would finally feel our sincerity as long as I raised Daryl and managed the household well. Not to mention, you and Janice had already divorced. Still, he's taking us as strangers after all these years. I think we should leave. There's no place for us here. Although Janice hadn't said anything, Kenneth got mad from Jessica's provocation and helped Daryl up, blurting, who's leaving? They're the ones who should leave. However, Kenneth regretted his words as soon as he finished speaking. Knowing what kind of horrible life Janice had lived in the past, he had no intention of driving her out. He would even agree to her request if she wished to spend the rest of her life in the Miller residence. Yet, he hadn't realized what he was saying in the heat of the moment. Throwing out hurtful words was like plunging a knife into someone's heart. And even if the wound turned into a scar, it would still hurt. But regardless, Kenneth was used to it. Even though he sensed that he had put his foot into his mouth, he couldn't take back his words. Quickly thinking of a solution, he thought of giving Janice some sort of compensation to make up for it. Meanwhile, Harold was livid as he said, "As long as I'm still alive, you have no right to make the call in this house. This is Janice's place. Where are you asking her to go? Calm down, Dad." Janice remained calm and poured a glass of water for him. Casually, she mocked, "He must have forgotten that I've cut ties with the Proctors a long time ago." Her words served as a reality check for Kenneth as memories flooded his head. After her suicide attempt, the Proctors had wanted to take her away, but Janice insisted on staying. So then they asked her to choose between them and him, forcing Janice to leave with them. Yet, she claimed that Kenneth was her world and that she couldn't live without him. That was what broke her family's heart. Her father himself said that he didn't have a daughter like her and that she would be all by herself from now onward. After they left, Janice had cried. And although Kenneth was impatient to leave, he softened up at her crying face. "Miller Residence is your home," he said. He had promised Janice that, and yet he was driving her out right now. The Proctors had abandoned her, and there was no place for her in Miller Residence. The world was big enough, but she had still lost a home. Complicated feelings churned within Kenneth. "I don't feel guilty, Kenny. There will never be peace as long as people like us stay under the same roof. I wished to host a nice birthday banquet for Dad, but I never expected that the peace couldn't be protected even on a day like today. If there's someone that has to leave, I wish that it could be me." Jessica interrupted. Kenneth grabbed Jessica's waist. "Why are you leaving when you're my wife?" He then turned to look at Harold. "Dad, I've been building up my career for so many years, and I've never complained once. If this is my punishment, I'm willing to accept it. But it is undeniable that Jessica is your daughter-in-law. Since everyone's here, we might as well tell them who my wife is." Harold glared at him, furious. "As I said, you have no right to make the call in this house." Daryl put on an innocent face. "Grandpa, we can understand that you have faith in Ethan. But he's gone now. Now that you're not acknowledging me as your grandson, do you want to end the bloodline with me?" Chapter 703. The way Daryl said that Ethan was no longer around prompted Kenneth to look at him sideways. "What did you say?" "Ethan was involved in an explosion, Dad. He's been missing till this day. He may have already passed away." Daryl said the most hurtful words with the gentlest tone. It left everyone dumbstruck. Even though Ethan spent many years building up his career in Allandia, no one could doubt his identity and capability. If Ethan was dead, Daryl would be the heir of the family. It was no wonder Harold was willing to let Daryl and Jessica return. That was the exact reason. Kenneth had heard of the rumors, but he simply deemed them as nonsensical stories made up by someone up to no good. He wouldn't believe that Ethan would pass away all of a sudden. Kenneth felt uneasy after hearing what Daryl said. "There's no irrefutable evidence for that." "Why would you say that?" "Dad, you've heard of the news of the exploded abandoned factory a few days ago. Do you think he could survive such a powerful explosion?" Daryl questioned back. Kenneth went silent for a while, his expression cold. Meanwhile, Harold had slowly recollected himself thanks to Janice's comfort. He reseated himself on his wheelchair and calmly looked at Daryl and Jessica. "Enough. Apologize to Olivia. Let's put an end to this matter." Daryl narrowed his eyes, wondering why things weren't going according to his plan. Jessica grumbled, "Dad, Liv was the one who splashed water at Daryl. Why should he apologize? Why should he apologize? Because I know how kind and bright of a person she is after spending some time with her. And I know how evil your son is too," Harold exclaimed. After getting used to wielding her power at home these days, Jessica thought that the Millers were under their control. She couldn't put up with how Harold reprimanded Daryl right in front of so many people. "Dad, I know that you have always looked down upon me because of my family background, thinking that I don't deserve Kenneth. But we're genuinely in love. The past long years have proven that this is a fact as well. It wasn't easy for us to build up our careers all these years. Why do you have such a biased opinion of us? What did we do wrong?" Jessica cried. It put Harold in the limelight, making the spectators think that he was a cruel father. "Mr. Harold, what is there that you can't get over with after so many years? A forced marriage isn't common nowadays. I know, right? I would have been grateful if my son was as devoted as Kenneth. There's never a happy ending when the process is a forceful one. So why? Daryl's your biological grandson. Don't take it so far. The other people joined the gushing, criticizing Harold for being cruel. Enough talking. Harold pointed at Jessica. Do you think that you are innocent after wrecking someone's family? You plotted so many schemes just to ruin a family. I've never looked down on anyone poor, but I do look down on someone who's poor and could stoop this low. Jessica held her hand on her chest, pretending to be hurt. Harold didn't even humiliate her like this that year. Don't cross the line, Dad. Jessie is my wife. Kenneth still stood up for Jessica. But Harold found it a waste of time to debate with him, so he simply wore an indifferent expression. Your wife. Very well, let me show you what kind of person your wife is. I was going to tolerate it considering that today was a happy occasion, but they've taken advantage of it and ruined my birthday. Now that I'm upset, don't think that you can get away with this. Chapter 704. Dad, there are a lot of people watching. Don't cause trouble, you'll be a laughing stock, Daryl said, trying to stop Harold too. Grandpa, since you dislike me this much, Mom and I might as well leave. Hope you won't regret this. Let's go, Mom. It was clearly a threat. Kenneth grabbed Daryl and Jessica's hands. As long as I'm here, I won't let you leave. Dad, Olivia's the cause of this matter. Is it that difficult to demand an apology from her? I think the person who should apologize isn't her, but your son. A gentle voice resounded from the crowd. Olivia turned in the direction of the familiar voice. It was the person she met once in the airport, Keith. The girl standing next to him was tugging his hand, seemingly disliking the idea of him getting involved in the Millers' family matter. However, Keith didn't yield to power and approached them confidently. As a doctor, he first asked Olivia, "Are you all right?" It had been 2 years since they last met after separating ways during that winter. He didn't know how her condition was, but he reckoned that her illness was under control. Still, the next 5 years after surgery were a dangerous period for Olivia. He asked her that question because he noticed that she didn't look well. Olivia forced herself to smile. "I'm all right, thanks for the concern. You're pushing yourself too hard again. You better get to the hospital after this," Keith kindly reminded her. Their interaction was a new reason for Daryl to cause trouble. "Who is this?" "Olivia, it's only been a few days since Ethan left. Are you that desperate to find your next target?" Keith responded gently, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Daryl. I'm a doctor, and I have a fiancé. I'm here with her, so I hope you can watch your words. We're grown-ups, after all. Sharing a few words doesn't mean that something's going on between us. Olivia and I are alumni. She was also my patient. We have been friends since we were in the country." After explaining, he added, "This is your family matter, so I don't want to intervene. But I just couldn't put up with your bad acting anymore. When my fiancé was shooting a video of the interior, she happened to record the scene of you getting splashed. If you don't want me to reveal it, please sincerely apologize to Olivia instead of causing trouble." Daryl never expected someone to stand up for Olivia. If what he said to Olivia was revealed, his image would be ruined. However, an apology from him would be tantamount to admitting that he was at fault. Daryl looked at Keith coldly. "Since you know that this is our family matter, stay out of this." Keith was unfazed. "It seems like you have no intention to apologize to her." Keith took his phone out, and a look of guilt flashed across Daryl's face. "Don't you dare. You can try me, Mr. Daryl," Keith replied. The people watching were excited for the show, a show with a surprising plot twist at that. They were curious about what had happened that made Olivia so angry that she splashed water at Daryl. Keith had been putting up with it for a while, and his patience had reached its limits. Ignoring Daryl's threat, Keith clicked the video file. He then put the video on full screen and raised the volume to the max. Daryl's provocative voice echoed in the hall, "You look cold, but you have quite a temper. It makes me curious about something. Does your character change this much in bed as well?" Everyone surged into a commotion. It was clearly harassment, not to mention that it was directed at his sister-in-law. Everyone wondered if Daryl was a pervert. Chapter 705. Never in Daryl's dreams had he imagined someone would have recorded that scene, let alone reveal it by disregarding the Millers' reputation. Keith had literally torn down Daryl's facade. The ladies around woke up from their dream, not expecting such a gentleman to be a pervert. Janice couldn't rein her anger in. Infuriated, she smashed a champagne bottle onto Daryl's head. Daryl and Jessica had been doing everything in their power to anger Janice, but it had been in vain. However, that remark of Daryl alone made Janice lose it. "I'm gonna send you to hell, you bastard," she cried. Daryl's head began bleeding along his forehead. Jessica couldn't keep acting anymore either. She wanted to use the same method to hit Janice back, but the butler stopped her. "Kenneth, it was only a tease. Even if he's at fault, Janice shouldn't have hurt him. I guess there's no place for us here." "Daryl, come on, let's get out of here," Jessica exclaimed. "Fine, get out of here as you wish. Don't be a pain in the ass here," Harold roared. He wished he could smash Daryl's head himself. "I didn't acknowledge you guys before this, and I never will. Someone menacing like you doesn't deserve to be my grandson." Hearing that, Daryl raised his head with dark eyes. His malicious gaze stared right at Harold. "Are you sure, Grandpa?" Daryl's wound hadn't stopped bleeding. The streak of blood flowed down his forehead, making him appear even more evil. "Since everyone is here, please be our witness. Laugh at us all you want, but I, Harold Miller, announce that Daryl Miller shall never lay a foot in Miller residence again. Since you wanna leave, I'll grant your wish. Call the butler over, pack their things up and throw them out. That includes Daryl and Jessica," Harold roared. Jessica finally came back to her senses. She was used to controlling other people by putting herself down, yet she forgot about one thing: it was only useful against Kenneth. Harold resented her to begin with, let alone the fact that Daryl and Jessica kept causing a ruckus today. They even attempted to force the Millers to drive Janice out of Miller residence. It wasn't something that could be tolerated. Thus, Harold finally made up his mind. These kinds of people were like snakes. No matter what he did, there was no sense of kinship in their bones. There were only facades and benefits. Jessica was frantic. She finally got to enjoy the feeling of becoming Mrs. Miller. For the past few days, everyone was at her beck and call. And now, Harold's announcement was like a lightning strike upon her, destroying her whole world. How would she be able to accept such a sudden downfall? Hurriedly, she threw herself into Kenneth's arms. "Hubby, I almost passed away from losing too much blood during delivery back then. I worked hard to raise Daryl, and yet, this is how the Millers treat us. Don't cry. I've said that both of you don't have to leave as long as I'm here. Edmund, call the doctors. Hurry," he comforted Jessica while covering his wound with a cloth. Daryl's expression had darkened and he had completely lost it because of Harold. "Grandpa, this is your choice. Since you don't want to acknowledge me, don't blame me for not seeing us as a family. Do you believe that it just takes a phone call from me to—" Before Harold could say anything, a man's voice resounded, "It takes a phone call from you to what?" Daryl's body stiffened and Olivia immediately raised her head. Chapter 706. Unbeknownst to everyone, a group of men in suits had suddenly appeared at the entrance. Calvin and Brent had obvious wounds on their solemn faces. They respectfully stood behind Ethan. Meanwhile, there was a scar on Ethan's brow. Ethan's cold and dominant aura loomed over the place. Daryl gaped in disbelief. How could this be? "Didn't you?" Ethan strode over with an icy expression. He then picked up the pace and stood right before Daryl in no time. Ethan reached out and grabbed Daryl's neck without a word. In comparison to Ethan, Daryl was thinner. This put him on the chopping block against Ethan's attack. The only thing Daryl could do was to reflexively take a few steps back. However, Ethan was walking faster and faster. Noticing that there was some champagne behind them, Jessica yelled, "Stop! Stop right there!" She shouted with all her might, but it was in vain. Her only hope was Edmund. "Edmund, stop him!" But Edmund stood still with an indifferent expression. "Mr. Ethan is rooting out the bad guys." His response almost made Jessica faint from anger. She swayed Kenneth's arm, pleading, "Kenny, save our son." However, Kenneth didn't move a muscle. "It's too late," he said. As soon as he said those words, there was a smashing sound. Everyone was dumbfounded. The small mountain of champagne fell just like that. Like a waterfall, the champagne drenched the duo while the floor got scattered with broken glasses. Daryl's back hit a pillar, and dizziness kicked in. Before Daryl could react, Ethan's icy voice rang into his ears. "It seems like you didn't take my warning seriously." Ethan then casually grabbed a champagne bottle, placing it near Daryl's neck. The fragmented glass was close to Daryl's veins. "If you don't learn how to stay low, I can teach you how to do it," Ethan said. Seeing that Daryl's neck was going to bleed, Jessica couldn't care about anything else anymore. She ran toward Ethan. "Ethan, let him go. He's your brother." "Brother." Ethan scoffed and sneered. "I've let him off the hook again and again because we're brothers," but he kept crossing the line. "Daryl Miller, you had this coming." Ethan pushed Daryl down. Daryl knelt on the floor of shattered glasses because he couldn't withstand Ethan's enormous strength. The fragments of glass cut his knees and he shrieked in pain. Kenneth chimed in to stop Ethan. "Don't go too far. Let him go." Ethan merely spared Kenneth a cold glance and in an icy tone, he said, "You have no right to intervene in the Millers' matters." Withdrawing his gaze, Ethan looked at Kelvin. "Keep an eye on him. If he stands up, break his legs." "Got it, Mr. Ethan." "What should I do if someone stops me?" Kelvin asked. That question clearly served as a warning for Jessica. "Then beat that person up too." Ethan then approached Olivia without looking back. He walked through the crowd, finally meeting the person he had missed all day and all night. Without a care for everyone's gazes, Ethan hugged Olivia and whispered into her ear, "Sorry for making you have a hard time." Chapter 707. Olivia's gastric was killing her, and frustration bubbled up in her due to Daryl's scheming. But Ethan's embrace made her feel safe, as though she was an abandoned puppy that finally found its owner. Ethan gently caressed Olivia's face. And although she was wearing makeup, he could tell that something was wrong with one glance. Feeling unwell, since there were a lot of watchful eyes, Olivia put up with the pain and smiled. "I'm fine. I'm glad that you're back." Ethan glanced at the cold sweat on her forehead, assuming that Daryl and Jessica's scheming was the cause of her discomfort. Hence, Ethan was determined to clear up the mess as soon as possible. He cooed, "Don't be afraid. I'm back now. No one can bully you again." He then shifted his gaze onto Jessica. "I've heard of what happened in the past few days. I thought of saying this after today since today's Grandpa's birthday. But since you keep rambling about wanting to leave, I might as well grant you your wish. Edmund, pack her stuff." Jessica wanted Janice out of Miller residence, but why was she the person who was going to end up leaving instead? A sense of competition blazed in her. She quickly grabbed Kenneth's hand. "Kenny, look at him. I'm his stepmother, how can he treat me this way?" Ethan responded before Kenneth could say anything, "You cut ties with the Millers 20 years ago. Now I'm the rightful heir of the family. I can make the calls for the Millers' matters. Mr. Kenneth, please take your wife out of my house." Ethan had finally run out of patience and intended to straighten things out as quickly as possible. His remarks didn't leave a tinge of respect to Kenneth at all. Before this, Ethan had to consider their kinship, but Kenneth hadn't done the same. Kenneth hadn't respected Janice and Olivia. Thus, nothing was holding Ethan back anymore. As long as he didn't have morality, no one would be able to guilt-trip him. Blood was thicker than water. Well, Ethan didn't receive any parental love since he was born, so why should he try to please Kenneth? "How dare you speak to me that way? I'm your father," Kenneth exclaimed. Ethan smirked, not wanting to waste time with him. Turning around, Ethan faced the guests. "Dear guests, I apologize for the disgraceful hospitality. It is our fault for the unbecoming ministrations. It looks like we have some family matters to deal with today. Next time, I will entertain all of you with something grander." Ethan's extraordinary aura and inherent leadership rendered everyone to naturally yield to him. Ethan was different from his gentle brother and clueless father. This was how the head of the Miller family should act. Although the guests would have loved to enjoy the show, they could only leave because Ethan had said to. "Okay, Mr. Ethan." Kelvin scanned the surroundings. Following that, he approached Jessica with a white napkin. Mrs. Miller, are you going to stop or do you need my help for that? Jessica was dumbfounded by how cruel Ethan was. Kenneth, whose dignity as the father was challenged, roared, "How dare you!" Jessica cried louder since Kenneth had her back. However, Kenneth's response merely prompted Ethan to take and shove the white napkin into Jessica's mouth. "I've reminded you." Chapter 708. Now that Jessica couldn't speak, she glared at Ethan in disbelief. She hadn't expected him to do that to his stepmother. "Jessie." Kenneth hurriedly removed the napkin from her mouth. Jessica wanted to whine in reflex, but Ethan's cold gaze stopped her. She then pointed at Daryl lying on the ground. "Save our son first." Kenneth knew that now was not the time to fight with Ethan. Daryl's life was of utmost priority. "Okay, stop crying." Ethan let go of Jessica before striding toward Kelvin. Let him go. Despite Kenneth's forceful aura, Kelvin wasn't working for Kenneth. So why would Kelvin listen to him? Besides, Kelvin was infuriated upon learning what Kenneth had done to the young Ethan. Not giving Kenneth 2 punches was already Kelvin's best mercy. So Kelvin ignored Kenneth. Kenneth's expression turned gloomy, feeling that he wasn't being respected again. "I told you to let go of him. Are you deaf?" Kelvin dug his ear while boldly looking at Kenneth. "Can't do that without Mr. Ethan's orders. You have a death wish." Kenneth angrily raised his hand, wanting to slap Kelvin in the face. But Kelvin would never let Kenneth do as he wished, and he was happy that he had the chance to fight back. Kenneth exercised every day, but Kelvin was a trained special agent. Even though Kelvin was injured, he could readily take Kenneth down. Kelvin restrained Kenneth's hands to the back and flashed a relaxed smile. "I have no choice, Mr. Kenneth. Mr. Ethan has said the words. I can beat anyone up if they stop me. The first time is a warning. Next time, I'll do it for real." Kenneth was so angry that his face turned crimson. He didn't expect his dignity to be stomped by a younger man. Anxiety and anger got the best of him as he yelped at Ethan, "Manage your men properly." Ethan motioned Kelvin to release Kenneth. With a flushed face, Kenneth primped his clothes to let out his awkwardness. He then angrily pointed at Janice. "Look at how rude your son is. Why doesn't he just go to hell?" As soon as Kenneth blurted that, Janice stepped forward to slap him, putting him into a trance. Kenneth was in utter disbelief. He had seen a lot of women falling head over heels for him, but it was his first time getting slapped by a woman. "You slapped me," he stuttered. Janice coldly deadpanned, "I slapped you because you're a bastard. You've never fulfilled your duty as the father, so what right do you have to ask him to acknowledge you as his father?" Harold spoke up. "You should have foreseen this awkward scene the moment you gave up on your family, child, and inheritance, right? We're all grown-ups. We should be responsible for our choices. One can never have everything in this world. You own the love you're proud of but lose the power. That is fair." At that moment, over 10 maids carried bags over from upstairs. Harold waved his hand. "Leave, and do not return anymore. I'll pretend that I don't have a son like you." Kenneth stared at his old father. He was no longer the vigorous figure who had caned him back then. He had repented his past actions. But it didn't matter if they were right or wrong. There was no turning back for him. All he could do was to move on. There were so many things he wanted to say, but they ended up into something simple. "Take care, Dad." Jessica, who was unwilling to accept her defeat, grabbed Kenneth's hand and shouted, "Hubby, this is our home. Why should we leave?" Chapter 709. Kenneth turned at Jessica. "Aren't you the person who keeps wanting to leave?" Hurt, tears trickled down Jessica's cheeks. "Do you think I want to stay here? I simply can't bring myself to make our son leave. He followed us around while we built our careers for so many years. He's suffered a lot." Jessica then knelt before Harold. "Dad, do you know how tough our life was? I know that you look down upon me because of my family background, but what did Daryl do wrong? The Millers, blood runs in him, and the person Kenneth likes is clearly me. You drove us apart and drove Kenneth out of the house. Even though we're married, people outside still look down upon us. Daryl is the most pitiful person here. He has a family, but he has to bear the title of an illegitimate child. He was bullied since he was young and used to return home with bruises over his body. Do you know how much it hurt to see him like that as his mother? He's an innocent child. He should be getting good teaching and enjoying all sorts of resources like Ethan. Yet, he was called an illegitimate child and humiliated. Things shouldn't have been this way. Take pity on us and acknowledge Daryl, please. He's your biological grandson, Jessica cried. Harold remained unfazed at her touching words. He then turned to look at Edmund. Bring the box in my study over. Edmund nodded. Kenneth wanted to help Jessica up, but she wouldn't let this chance slip through her fingers. She yanked him over instead. Kenny, tell him what you really want to say. Don't bottle it up. Kenneth turned his face away. I have nothing to say. Jessica just wished he wouldn't be this stubborn. Had he not been this stubborn, they would have been able to return to the Millers a long time ago. She wouldn't have needed to put on a show. Edmund held a steel box and Harold opened it to take some things out of it. Back when I drove Kenneth out of the house, I froze his bank accounts because I wondered if you would reveal your true colors when he was broke. But Janice was silly and lent him money. Here's the credit note. The credit note was worth $10 million. He continued, she was the person getting hurt the most and yet she couldn't bring herself to see Kenneth, that foolish man, having a rough time. She lent him money behind my back. She found out that he was going to develop his career somewhere else and then contacted her acquaintance over there to help him out. Hearing that, Kenneth looked at Janice in disbelief. Is that true? Back then, his career had been smooth and he had been thinking that it was because he was one of the Millers. He didn't know that it was Janice's money. Janice indifferently answered, it's no longer important. Do you think that you were so lucky to have so many clients? She begged her father and grandmother and contacted her relatives to help you out. That was why you were successful. While Janice was helping you out, what was Jessica doing? Harold asked. Kenneth didn't know. Harold threw a few pictures. They were pictures of Jessica purchasing luxuries and posh cars. She also headed to high-end restaurants and house agencies and traveled. Harold continued, she splurged your money buying houses and cards. She led her poor family in and sucked your money dry. Chapter 710. Kenneth's brows furrowed. He thought of those days when he was busy round the clock. Jessica had kept asking him for money. She told him that her father fell seriously ill, her mother was having a heart attack the next day, or her brother was in trouble. She even claimed that her father was sent to the ICU, which had cost a lot of money every day. And there were many other expenses too. After Kenneth gave her over $10,000, she would make up all sorts of excuses again. To him, Jessica had always been a simple and innocent woman. He didn't perceive her as someone materialistic. Thus, he didn't think of her that way. They were a married couple anyway, so his money was hers as well. It was just that he didn't have much money in his hands back then, and $10 million wasn't enough to run a company. Jessica would make excuses to take over every project too. His circumstances were rough, but he didn't even complain once. He even suggested paying her father a visit, but Jessica told him that it would be enough for her to look after her father because Kenneth was busy with work. At that time, he even laid off his driver and assistant to save some money. He took everything upon himself and worked hard. One day, he was so tired that he even fainted after meeting a client. Before he lost his consciousness, Kenneth had thought he saw a woman. But she vanished after he regained consciousness. From that day onward, the value of his orders grew. Some of them even forewent a deposit from him and let him delay the material payment for 6 months. In fact, he was able to slog through those rough days all thanks to Janice. Harold then threw out another stack of pictures again. There were pictures of Kenneth getting drunk after meeting clients, and Janice was kneeling and kneading his legs. There were also pictures of Jessica going on a family trip. Her bright smile was a stark contrast to his situation. Now, Kenneth finally realized that the person suffering with him wasn't Jessica, but Janice. Do you think that people will pay you respect once you're driven out of the family and have moved to a new place? You should be grateful that they didn't take advantage of you. While you were out there working, Janice begged them behind your back so that you could run your business smoothly. And what was the woman you loved doing? She was ready to run away at any time. She was afraid that you might not be able to rise back up again, So she kept wanting money from you to buy houses for herself and her family. She brought them on trips and bought them luxury goods. You see her as your whole world, but she sees you as a cash cow. Despite Harold's soft voice, it hit home. Kenneth's head was buzzing. Jessica hurriedly explained, "Hubby, it's not like that. Dad just hates me so much. Those pictures are edited. I didn't do those things." Kenneth pointed at the dates on the pictures. "Are those edited as well?" "Yes. Editing technology has advanced a lot nowadays. It's even able to add a date. You know what kind of person I am. Don't you believe in me? Besides, it's not like you don't know Janice's character. Why would she do something and not ask for credit from you?" No matter how hard Jessica tried to prove herself, it was useless. Harold snorted coldly. "Edited? I have a lot of evidence like this. Just name it and I can show it to you." Edmund added, "Yes, Mr. Kenneth. I can vouch for that. After all, Mr. Harold was still worried about you that year. So I was asked to protect you in the dark. That's why I knew everything that Mrs. Miller and Miss Potts had done. If you don't believe it, I can give you the memory card." Other than this, Miss Potts intervened in a lot of relevant matters. If Mr. Harold and Mrs. Miller didn't help you out in secret, you would have gone broke because of Miss Potts' family. Kenneth was dumbstruck to learn that that was the truth.